I recently reviewed all of the Robbie Lawler and Carlos Condit fights available on the UFC Fight Library in preparation for UFC 195, which is coming up in a week or so, January 2nd, I believe. There was maybe 22, I think, Lawler fights going back to, what was it, 2002. And I think there were 15. Yeah, there were 15 Condit fights going back to 2007. And when there's a fight that I'm interested in, I like to go back and watch all the previous fights, even the ones that I'm familiar with, just to kind of really try to get a good sense of the development of the two fighters to date, and what might happen in terms of making some kind of predictions for the fight to come. What strategies might they employ against one another? These kind of things. So yeah, out of the two of these guys, if I had to pick a favorite, I think it would be Carlos Condit. Condit I see as having a far more diverse kind of a skill set, in terms of his martial arts. He has all kinds of weapons, you know, from his knees to his elbows to his hands to his feet to his, he fights very well off of his back. He seems to, if you watch his career, you'll see that he seems to prefer to stay on his feet. But when somebody takes him down, they really should have thought against, doing that, because he ends up fighting very well off his back, and a lot of his fights end in submissions, in grappling, even though he doesn't necessarily aggress and make the takedown happen, make the fight go to the ground. He's very good when it gets there. So I like him for his overall diversity of tools, but I also just like his character. I mean, he's a very intelligent guy. I know he's into the kind of I don't know if he would call it the same thing, but kind of the movement natural scene, where you practice, all different kinds of movement skills that a human being should be fully versed in. So I like that about him. He's into the kind of the same way that I am. The idea that you try to optimize yourself as a human being, and so the martial arts is an aspect of this. But you see him training in all kinds of movement. So I suspect he has some very similar thinking to mine, at least in some respects. But I also see him as being a little bit crazy. He's got those crazy eyes, right? That tell you this is not a normal guy. It's not somebody you want to mess. This is like a psycho. He's got the psycho eyes a little bit. So I like him. I'm entertained by him. I'm entertained by him, and I identify with him in many respects. Lawler, on the other hand, reminds me of one of the kids that, when I was in high school, was kind of a bully to me. Lawler just looks like a jock, and his whole character is similar. Like he's a brawler. He's all boxing, although in recent years we've seen quite a bit of development in Lawler, and I'm going to talk about that. But for the large part of his career, as you're following him, he's just he's just a really heavy hitter. He just wants to knock people out with his hands, and he's a brawler, and he's very good at it. But I don't identify with with Robbie. He's just not my kind of character. He's a great fighter though, and in terms of overall fighters in the UFC, I do like Lawler, especially now, especially as he's developed in the most recent years. You've seen some skills come out, or be developed that take him out of just being a brawler. But like I said, I'll talk about that. All right, first let's go through a few things about Condit. Like I said, Condit has this diverse tool set. You see him using all kinds of, he really has all the limbs, right? And he knows how to use all of them. And he's very good with all of them. He's very good with knees. He's very good with elbows. He's very good with his feet, with his hands. He's very good grappling. He's all around, like in terms of martial arts, diversity of technique, he's got it. It's awesome. He has a lot of successes. He has some failures, in his career, and he has injury that we've seen. He's had a serious leg injury in many operations recently, not too distant past. One of the things that you see about Carlos Condit that I think is going to be interesting in the fight with Lawler is his ability. Like he has a good chin, right? He can take some battering. When he fought Hendricks, he got hit hard, and he absorbed it. When he fought McDonald, Rory, who you see here, the first couple of rounds, Rory, who was younger and much more aggressive, was kind of beating him up, but Condit's able to ride that out, and sometimes in the latter rounds turns things around and gets guys through ground and pounder submissions, these heavy strikers. And so I think this might be an interesting point to come in the fight against Lawler, although we've seen Lawler go multiple times, go 5 rounds and not really lose a lot of steam. He did earlier in his career. You can see him his arms getting very heavy earlier in his career, but his latter fights in the last few years have been really excellent. In the latter rounds, he hasn't run out of steam, but I do suspect Condit has more cardio endurance, and I think he could play that to his favor if he kept Lawler striking a lot and moving a lot. Lawler his energy could wane before Condit's does. So this is one aspect that I think that Condit could use. We do see in Condit's game that where does he have weaknesses? Well, he's really good off his back. He lost to GSP, but he only lost really in my estimation by points. He really did more damage. But there are fighters who can kind of wear him down by points, like GSP did. GSP basically, he got beat up by Condit, but he did a lot of taking him to the ground and then laying on top of him. And even though, Carlos did what he could to try to work towards submissions, GSP did a lot of laying on top of him, watching the clock, as you see here, waiting things out, knowing that he was ahead by points and could win, even though Condit, in terms of damage, probably did more. So I don't know how that would play into the Lawler fight exactly, because Lawler is not going to want to lay around on top of him. for sure. But again, it's not like Condit has any problem going through um, a long scale fight. I think he can be outstrengthed. His body. When you look at his body's not muscular like GSP's or like Lawler's in the same way. And this is why GSP I think is able so well to one of the aspects. I know he's just a great wrestler in general, and he's known for being able to take guys down at will. But he's stronger. He can outstrength Condit and use the strength to his advantages. I think Lawler can. He can outstrength Condit too. But will that strength be really such a big asset when it's just used in the striking? We'll have to see, because Condit has a pretty good chin. Of course, he has a leg injury, had to forfeit a fight because he broke a ligament and had to get multiple surgeries. We most recently saw him returning after his surgeries in 2015, his last fight against Alves, and he cleaned it up. I mean, he broke Alves' nose. You can see how it's just messed up here, and this is early. He broke his nose, and by round 2 they had to stop it because he was just wiping the mat with him. Condit showed that he definitely is still in good fighting shape even after his surgeries. But, there's a wide difference between Alves and Lawler. Let's look at Robbie Lawler. This is kind of early-ish in Lawler's career. He's fighting Nick Diaz. And like I said, I can't really identify that well with Lawler. At least I couldn't in his early years. He was just a guy who liked to come out and hit hard and stuff. He just wanted to punch hard. And he just wanted to brawl. And that's okay. It worked for him. He was winning fights. But I loved when he went against Nick Diaz, because to me, Lawler looks like the more his physique is more the typical like athletic physique as compared to Diaz. Diaz does a lot of endurance cardio training. But what was great about this fight was watching Diaz just knock Lawler out. I mean, Lawler fell like a tree because Diaz is a good boxer. So his strength really didn't matter when it came up against good boxing and somebody with really good cardio. But he didn't even need to go into the cardio range. Diaz had dropped him. I got a kind of this was, as I was watching the fights, I was happy. I was so happy to see Diaz knock him down like he did, and then I had to laugh at the fight. Just after Diaz, when Lawler goes to fight Tanner, suddenly Lawler goes from his the kind of hair that he had for all of his fights before that, which is like this kind of a shorter haircut, to his hair is suddenly longer and kind of bushier and all this kind of jazz. And it looked to me like a mimic of Nick Diaz's hair. But anyway, I was kind of down on Lawler when I first started watching his fights. Got into him later on, particularly around 2013 or so. Well, you see Lawler leave the UFC for a while and go in some other organizations to fight. actually shortly after losing to Diaz, he leaves the UFC. I think there was one or two fights after that, but then he leaves the UFC, doesn't come back till like 2013, and when he comes back, we see a very different Robbie Lawler. And this is where I start to find Lawler actually interesting, and enjoy him. His movement has changed. He has become a much better fighter. Even though like I went and watched his fights, I think around 2008 you start seeing this change in him. But by 2013, it's really apparent when he fights Volker here. Lawler now suddenly has all of his limbs, where before he just had his fists. Now his legs, particularly his leg kicks are vicious. They've become as heavy and as accurate as his hands. His movement has changed. He's become a much better moving boxer, much less kind of a stand in front of you and brawl kind of a guy. And it's impressive. It's impressive. And he takes that into his fight with Hendricks. His second fight with Hendricks was awesome. You see, in his second fight with Hendricks, really you see a Johnny Hendricks trying to pull a GSP and wait out the clock and trying to like hold Lawler down. And Lawler's able to stuff these attempts a lot, like Hendricks' attempts to like kind of just wrestle him into against the wall or take him down and lay on him. Lawler's able to stuff a lot of that and just ultimately ends up winning the fight in decision, and rightfully so. He really fought the fight, and he kind of makes a point of it at the end, talking about that's how champion fights are won. Fighting, hard. And not trying to wait out the clock. I think it was a jab that he was making at Hendricks. So, Lawler has really developed over his years to where now I find him a much more respectable fighter. He's still very much into the heavy hands, and now he's added heavy legs, but his movement is so much better. I see him much more as a martial artist than just the brawler that I originally did. So then what is to happen really when it comes to Lawler versus Condit? We know that Condit has a good chin. We know that he's faced heavy punchers before. And, sometimes he's lost, sometimes he's won. It's really hard to say what's going to happen, in this fight. I think it's going to go the whole way, unless somebody gets a freak kind of an injury where they have to stop the fight. I think the fight's going to go 5 rounds. I think it's going to be up to a decision, and I wouldn't doubt it's going to be a split decision on who wins. I don't see Robbie Lawler knocking Condit out. There's a possibility of the fight ending before the end of the 5th round if they get down on the ground, because I could see Condit moving Lawler into a submission. I could see that happening. But because Robbie's not going to take it to the ground, it might not really go to the ground much. I mean, I'm sure it will be up and down a bit, but it'll probably be there from the clinch kind of a thing, rather than either one of these guys trying to bring it down there, like going for the legs, So that's my kind of prediction on the fight. I think it's going to go the whole way. I think there's a possibility that, I think the likelihood is that the initial rounds are going to go in Lawler's favor. The latter rounds, I think, could more likely go in Condit's favor, because he tends to kind of warm up into the fight, and by round 3 and 4, you might see his best stuff. Lawler tends to put all his energy into the last round too. So the last round is could just be brutal. But yeah, I do see it going all the way, unless there's a submission, in which case the submission is probably going to be made by Condit. And when it goes to decision, it's really hard to say. My gut instinct is that if it goes to decision, Lawler's gonna win. But we'll see. So that's my thoughts on the fight and the skills of both of these fighters and where they both are at in their careers. Both of them have had injuries that have taken them out of fights, although I think Condit's is certainly more recent and more intense and could play a factor. Hard to say. Hope he's got his full abilities back and he's really ready for this title fight. Physically, with the injury recovery. I suppose that could play a role too, but I see it going all the way. We'll see what happens. So let me know what you all think in response, and look forward to actually seeing what happens in the fight.